extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, it really was. I was in the chamber just now for that statement, and I think, the tone of it, you could see at moments that Rachel Reeves was almost shaking with anger. She is clearly deeply frustrated by what she sees as a government, a previous government, that has done everything that it possibly can to, well, as she says, cover up some of those spending commitments. I think there were some really significant points in there, John, just to pull out. I mean, aside from the tone of it and really, some of the things that Rachel Reeves was saying about what she thinks the previous government have done, including hiding the scale of asylum costs to the system. She's made some very difficult decisions, she says, but that will impact on a lot of people. One of them is the decision to remove the winter fuel payment unless households are on pension credit. That will affect it will affect millions of people. The government is intending to maximise the take up of pension credit, presumably to deal with some of those people at the margins, but
Yeah.
that will be a big moment. It's a big step. All of the things that we'd been briefed in advance that we'd heard about, some of those transport measures, for example, plans to restore smaller railway lines, they've now been scrapped. I think another one that's going to cause some real consternation is a decision not to proceed with adult social care reform. Those charging reforms, this sounds quite complicated, but it was part of a much bigger plan to make sure that social care was fully funded. The Chancellor is saying that that will save £1 billion and that those changes can't proceed at the rate that they previously were. I mean, the other massive decision is of course, the public pay review bodies, the decision to accept their recommendations and to say that the government will support those pay review recommendations. I
Mm.
mean, they are significant. They will be between 5.5 and 6%, depending on which group of people we're talking about, from teachers to the armed forces, prison officers, and police. We've talked separately about junior doctors. That will cost a lot of money. I think ultimately, the response from Jeremy Hunt, the previous Chancellor, was to say, well, the Treasury usually manages these overspends in year. They can claw back some money here. Departments don't spend everything. Essentially saying you can tinker with the accounting to get rid of these problems. But I think at the end of the day, what Rachel Reeves is saying is that this government was making spending commitments it was never going to fulfill and that it knew it.
Yes.
And some of those economic experts now are coming out and seemingly backing her.
That's and that's where we go now from the accusation from Rachel Reeves of an unforgivable cover up to the shadow chancellor, now shadow chancellor's counter accusation of making what he called an utterly bogus attempt to hoodwink the public. There is bitter and rancor in this statement, and we're looking now, according to Rachel Reeves, in this important statement, at tax rises, spending cuts, efficiency savings in government departments, which means squeezing on government budgets. We're seeing welfare trimmed in the case of pensioners when it comes to winter fuel allowances, and there's much, much more to come. And what a statement it was from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. You heard it here live on Times Radio. The Chancellor accusing the government of a cynical cover-up of the true state of public finances, of piling on spending commitments, adding up to billions of pounds with no clear means of paying for it, and suggested that was all part of a political exercise in deceiving the public ahead of the election. Running up bills she suggested that the Conservative Party, then in government, knew they would not have to pay for. She sounded absolutely furious. It was like watching a prosecuting lawyer as much as watching the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And the comeback from Jeremy Hunt, the now shadow Chancellor, then the Chancellor when the Conservatives were in office, was equally vociferous. He accused the Labour government of concocting what he called a bogus story, saying they were simply concocting a story for the purpose of bringing in tax cuts they always intended to bring in, and are only now setting out under the guise of a remedial exercise he suggested was completely false. So who is right? Crucial question. Who's right about this? Are we, the people, are we being misled by the government, given tax rises to come and squeezes in public spending in our services, in a false story, a false narrative on the misdeeds of the last government? Or have we seen the bonnet opened? Have we seen the can of worms opened up and the truth revealed of the way public finances have been managed and mismanaged over a long period of the truth now only coming out, the cost only becoming clear, and the cost about to be paid. Well, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, they were on just a very short while ago here on Times Radio Drive. They saw some merit in Rachel Reeves' argument, said a lot of this was not known, as Rachel Reeves argued. Some of it was known, that there was not enough money for public services in the future. It would have to be found somewhere. And we all know, because we knew it, that tax rises always seem to be the very top of the list, or the Labour Party, then in opposition, now in government, were not willing to accept that as such. Alicia Fitzgerald is back with us. It's quite a story, Alicia, and what a scene of confrontation and genuine heat at Westminster.
Absolutely, and I think you could see that across both sides of the House of Commons as well. I think something else that was really notable was the amount of new Labour MPs who have now realised the grimness of politics sometimes. You know, they've come in, they've entered on quite a high for the Labour government, lots of these new members of Parliament, and this has been the first time really where they've listened to such a negative and quite damning political speech and had to actually really realise the realities of being in government. And sometimes it does mean these really quite awful moments where you do have to be really negative and quite bleak about the future. They've had those few weeks of it all being very positive, looking forward, and now this was the first really big, quite dire moment, I suppose.
I suppose the reaction to this is going to come from polar opposite directions. I mean, our listeners are writing in with their thoughts, and they're coming from polar opposite directions. This is from Scott, who supports the coming restriction on the winter fuel allowance. It's taking it away from those who do not rely on pension credit. And Scott says the couple down the road who for years have spent their winter fuel allowance on Christmas presents for the grandchildren will be gutted. And he says a sensible move, in my opinion. But here's a different view. This is from Nick, our listener. Thank you both for writing in. Nick says restrictions on child support and freezing pensioners to death. Were these the changes that Starmer referred to in the election campaign? How Labour has changed. So it's going to be seen through different prisms on either side. But it is objectively true to say that the bad news, which seems to have come as bad news to the government and now bad news to all of the rest of us, is genuinely bad news.
Definitely. And I think before the statement and her speech was given earlier, I think it's fair to have some level of scepticism when you hear a political party who've just entered government say that everything was awful and it was all the last person's fault, because that happens every time there is a change of government. But what Rachel Reeves did in that statement was prove things. She had facts, she had figures, and she can prove that this was not public knowledge because no one else knew about it. That was the first time we heard about that over $6 billion gap in the asylum scheme, for example, asylum processing, sorry. That was the first time we'd heard that. So there is clearly a basis of truth to that. Of course, there are some policies and some announcements she made today, including that winter fuel allowance one, that will be really controversial. I mean, there will be so many pensioners who are not on benefits, but who are not these really multi-millionaire pensioners that we keep hearing about, who are going to find that really difficult and who are going to struggle as a result. So definitely some policies in there that will have a lot of backlash, and a fair amount of backlash too. It's obviously important to scrutinise these things, even though they probably do have to happen at some point. So yeah, it's a difficult moment for Labour for sure to come forward and have to do all of that today and quite so soon into their premiership.
And Alicia, the big spending departments, she says, are going to have to find billions of pounds worth of savings. Now, savings means squeezing budgets. And whenever this thing comes up, and it comes up, intermittently, government departments and those who speak for government departments say, look, we're squeezed already. There is no more juice in this lemon. But she's asking for billions more on top of the tax increases and the other cuts that are on the way.
Well, absolutely. So there's only three ways really you can get more money as a government. That's increasing taxes, it's cutting public spending already, or it's increasing borrowing. And all of those three things no politician wants to do, especially when you've just begun as a new government. And she has remained really committed to the fact that she will not increase tax on working people. That's income tax and national insurance. But we don't yet know what that means for other types of tax. And that's the thing where there's a bit of a grey area, because as you said, there's more money that still needs to be generated somehow, and we don't know really how that's going to happen. All of the departments in government are so squeezed already. Lots of them have been squeezed for quite some time now, so it's going to be really difficult. Where are we going to find that money?
Right, and there's going to be lots of questions to Rachel Reeves on what's in store. I mean, nothing good seems to be in store, unless you take the view that you're a junior doctor, you're getting this 20% pay rise, or and this is not insignificant. You're one of the teachers who are now getting they're all getting an above inflation a pay offer from the government. Those pay review bodies are now in. The government's accepting the recommendations. That would be, on anything like a normal day, our biggest story, and we'd be talking about nothing else. But now it's just one of the headlines in there. And I guess it's trying to draw a line under the industrial strife that we've seen in public service after public service under the last government, well, for so many months.
Absolutely. And I think it's an interesting time for both that to happen and then this huge statement about how awful our fiscal and economic backdrop is, because clearly then the attack to the Labour Party will be, hang on, if you've got this black hole and you can't afford anything, how can you afford to give so many people big pay rises? So that will be a difficult one for them to back up.